She was called unattractive by everyone who saw her, but when Captain Elias Reed told the Velian diplomat, "You're beautiful," she froze completely. Her obsidian armor and crystalline spine seemed to shimmer under the station lights as she processed a compliment she'd never allowed herself to accept. What happens when a war-hardened alien confronts a human definition of beauty she spent lifetimes rejecting? Captain Elias Reed sipped from his dented thermos, the liquid inside bitter and lukewarm. Through the reinforced viewport of Outpost 9, Terrace 4 hung suspended in the black, its atmosphere a pale blue shroud over continents still scarred by orbital bombardments. The peace felt thin here, like cheap plastic stretched over a fresh wound. Every system on the station hummed with the tension of something that could snap. The air recyclers pushed a stale metallic breeze through the vents. The gravity plates emitted a low, inconsistent thrum, and the mess hall's kitchen exhaust pumped out the greasy odor of reprocessed protein packs. This wasn't a place for permanence. It was a breathing monument to 30 years of ceasefire, maintained by mutual exhaustion and the knowledge that restarting the war would cost more than either side could bear. Her arrival broke the routine. The Verlian Concord's diplomatic shuttle docked with a silence that felt aggressive, a sleek black needle sliding into the station's worn-out embrace. They hadn't sent a soldier or a politician. They sent Kari. She moved through the access tunnel without sound, her form encased in armor that looked less like protection and more like an extension of her body, polished obsidian plates interlocking with a crystalline spinal structure that rose like sharp, geometric frost along her back. Junior engineers whispered that she was striking, hell, even beautiful in a terrifying way, but she gave no acknowledgement. Her eyes, pale and unblinking, scanned the bay with the detached precision of a targeting system. She didn't need to speak. Her presence did all the talking. Lieutenant Ferris leaned into Elias's personal space, his voice low. "Intel says she's high caste, very high. Don't let the diplomat tag fool you. Verlians don't negotiate like we do. Their idea of a trade discussion could involve rearranging your organs if the terms aren't met." Elias just watched her. She was examining a bulkhead seam as if judging its structural weakness. There was an economy to her motion, nothing wasted. No gesture for reassurance, no glance for approval. She was a closed system. Back in his quarters, Elias reviewed her file. Minimal. Verlian records weren't for sharing. What they did have were fleet engagement reports, battle assessments, patterns. The Concord valued efficiency above all. Honor wasn't about mercy, it was about optimal outcomes. Their culture was built on a logic so alien it felt like madness. A system where a children's rhyme could contain tactical doctrine, and a peace treaty might be sealed with a biological weapon held in reserve. Carrie wasn't just from the other side of a border. She was from the other side of reason. Over the next few cycles, she became a specter in the corridors. Personnel gave her a wide berth, not out of hatred but unease. She didn't eat in the mess, didn't use the rec facilities. She was often in the observation blister, staring out at the nebula gas clouds, her dark form a silhouette against the star-flecked void. Sometimes Elias would catch a junior tech trying to get a reaction, a dropped tool, a deliberately loud joke. Nothing worked. She was a statue, a very sharp, very dangerous statue. The station's environmental systems chose that week to act up. A humidity regulator failed in Sector 7, and the air grew thick and damp. Algae started blooming in the coolant vents. The place smelled like a swamp. Elias found her one evening near the malfunctioning unit, watching a maintenance team with what he could only describe as analytical disdain. "Problems?" she asked. Her voice was cool, layered, like stone settling deep underwater. Elias shrugged. "Just the station remembering it's old." She didn't smile. "Inefficient design. Your species relies on redundancy rather than precision." It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. But it underscored the divide. They built things to last. The Verlians built things to work perfectly once. He started noticing smaller things. The way she tilted her head slightly when listening to the comms traffic, as if decoding more than language. The specific, careful distance she kept from all human personnel. Exactly 1.8 meters he measured at once. Never closer, never farther. It was a buffer zone, a defensive perimeter. Ferris's warning echoed. She could probably kill with her hands faster than most people could with a pistol. And here they were, trying to discuss mineral rights and transit lanes. The command staff meeting was a study in friction. Humans argued. They waved hands. They talked over each other. Carrie sat perfectly still. When she finally spoke, it was to point out a flaw in the proposed security arrangement, a blind spot in the sensor coverage along the drift region. She didn't say, "This is wrong." She said, "This vector presents an unacceptably high risk probability." She reframed their error in her own terms. It was more effective than shouting. Elias began to understand. Her armor wasn't just physical. It was everything. Her speech, her posture, her silence. It was all a defense against a universe that had, for her entire life, only understood value through function. Beauty was the irrelevant variable. Softness was a design flaw. And into this carefully controlled ecosystem of suspicion, he was about to introduce a grenade in the form of 5 simple words. The air in the corridor felt charged like before a lightning strike. This wasn't just a diplomatic posting anymore. It was a powder keg. And he was holding a match. Elias began leaving small offerings on the console near her usual observation post. Not grand gestures, just things. A pouch of roasted nuts from Earth still sealed. A bar of dark chocolate with a high cocoa percentage. He didn't present them. He just left them there, a silent invitation. The first time the nuts sat for 3 full cycles. On the 4th, they were gone. No note, no acknowledgement. The next time he added a scrawled label. Edible regret. Consume at own risk. He found her studying the chocolate bar the following day, turning it over in her gloved hands as if performing a material analysis. "This is not standard rations," she stated. Her tone gave nothing away. "It's not," Elias agreed, leaning against the bulkhead, careful to maintain her preferred distance. "It's a luxury good. An inefficient use of resources, probably, but it has its moments." She didn't eat it then, but later he saw the wrapper in the recycler, neatly folded. Their interactions became a series of small, cautious experiments. He brought 2 cups of the station's synthetic coffee to a briefing, sliding one across the table to her. She eyed the steaming liquid with deep suspicion. "I have analyzed the chemical composition of your recreational beverages," she informed him. "This one is particularly corrosive." Elias took a sip, wincing only slightly. "We call it coffee." "I call it thermal solvent masquerading as a drink. It's a tradition." She didn't touch hers, but she didn't push it away either. The flicker happened during a discussion about deuterium mining quotas. Elias made a dry comment about bureaucratic paperwork being the real final frontier. For a fraction of a second, the rigid line of her mouth softened. Not a smile. Something smaller. A micro-expression, a brief glitch in her otherwise impeccable armor. It was gone so fast he wondered if he'd imagined it. But the air in the room felt different afterward. Less like a standoff, more like a very careful dance. They learned each other's rhythms. He was warmth and improvisation. She was precision and cold logic. His humor was a blunt instrument. Her silence was a scalpel. Navigating a conversation with her felt like learning to walk in 0G. Every move required counterbalance, a conscious management of momentum. He'd throw out a casual human idiom. She'd dissect its literal meaning with terrifying accuracy, forcing him to explain the metaphor. It was exhausting and, against all odds, fascinating. The main briefing room became their primary stage. Humans, in Elias's opinion, weaponized PowerPoint. They built slide decks like fortifications, layers of bullet points and blurry charts designed to overwhelm through volume. Carrie observed these presentations with the placid demeanor of a bomb disposal expert, observing a particularly unstable device. During a particularly convoluted presentation on cross-border traffic management, she finally spoke. "This is bureaucracy as performance art." The junior lieutenant at the podium froze. Carrie continued, her voice flat. "You have created a system so complex its primary function is to perpetuate its own existence. This is not efficiency. It is weaponized absurdity." The room went quiet. Elias hit a cough that was mostly a laugh. She wasn't wrong. She had just named the unspoken rule of half their institutions. After that, a strange banter developed. It was their through line. He'd propose a convoluted human-centric solution to a problem. She'd dismantle it with Verlian logic. He started anticipating her critiques, building them into his own plans preemptively. Once, after he'd successfully navigated a trade negotiation by using a bizarre anecdote about his aunt's antique market stall, Carrie regarded him for a long moment. Your methodology is chaos, she stated. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, charming chaos. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd ever given. This fragile rapport was built on a foundation of professional necessity, but it was becoming something else. A thread of understanding stretched across the gulf between their cultures. He learned that her pauses weren't always dismissals. Sometimes they were processing, translating human emotional subtext into a data format she could work with. She learned that his jokes, however inelegant, were rarely malicious. Often they were a pressure valve, a way to bleed tension from a situation that felt too close to breaking. They found a neutral ground in the station's technical schematics. Both could speak the language of systems, of power flow and structural integrity. Standing over a hollow display of the coolant network, they could have a conversation that felt almost equal. He pointed out a potential failure point in a coupling valve. She suggested a reinforcement alloy her people used, citing its tensile strength and thermal tolerance. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated collaboration. No politics, just problem solving. This careful bridge of shared competency and tolerated idiosyncrasy became the foundation for everything that followed. It was a thread of connection spun in a place designed for disconnect, a small pocket of mutual respect in a cold war of ideologies. He no longer saw just the diplomat, the weapon, the other. He saw a person operating within a ruthless framework, someone who had chosen to engage with his messy, illogical methods instead of simply dismissing them. This was the unstable, carefully maintained ground upon which he would eventually choose to stand and say the words that changed everything. The words that weren't for her. He found her in the main observatory, a place she'd claimed as her own since arrival. The dome was transparent to the vacuum, a perfect hemisphere of black space and hard light. She stood with her back to the door, a silhouette cut from something darker than the void itself. The station's running lights cast a low blue gleam along the sharp geometric lines of her crystalline spine, making it look less like a part of her and more like a piece of alien architecture she wore. Elias stopped a few meters away, respecting the distance she always demanded. The only sound was the faint hum of the environmental systems and the deeper, almost subsonic thrum of the station's core. It was the quietest place on Terrace 4, a pocket of stillness in a metal world built on noise and anxiety. He didn't speak at first. He just watched her watch the stars. The Rosette Nebula sprawled across the view, a vast cloud of glowing hydrogen and stellar nurseries, its colors bleeding from deep red to pale pink. It was a violent, beautiful process on a scale that made human concerns feel microscopic. He wondered what she saw when she looked at it. Tactical positions, resource deposits, or something else. Something she kept locked down behind all that polished obsidian and calculated silence. Their strange, cautious rapport felt paper-thin here in the face of that immensity. The question formed itself before he could properly weigh the risk. It felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability, the next logical step in the strange equation they'd been building. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the hum of the dome. Has anyone ever told you that you're beautiful? The change in her was instantaneous and absolute. She didn't turn. She didn't move a muscle, but her entire posture locked, the minimal relaxation she ever displayed evaporating in a microsecond. She went from a living, breathing presence to a statue, a perfectly carved, lethally sharp statue. The station lights seemed to catch on the facets of her crystalline structure differently, refracting the blue into colder, sharper splinters of light. It was as if the word itself had physical weight, and she was bracing against it. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all trace of their recent, almost friendly banter. It was flat, layered with a finality that sounded like an airlock ceiling. That word is not for me. There was no anger in it, no offense, just a simple declarative fact, stated with the same tone she might use to report a malfunctioning sensor array. Elias didn't retreat. He held his ground, his own hands loose at his sides. Why not? She turned her head just slightly, a minimal rotation that allowed one pale eye to regard him from her profile. The movement was unnervingly precise. It is a word for soft things, for fragile things, things of ornament, not function. She looked back at the nebula, dismissing him and the concept in one gesture. I am not soft, he understood then. It wasn't modesty. It wasn't a deflection. It was a fundamental categorization error in her worldview. Beauty was a variable she had assigned a very specific, limited value, and it didn't apply to her model of existence. To suggest otherwise wasn't a compliment. It was a mislabeling, an inaccuracy to be corrected. For someone built on precision, it was probably the deepest kind of insult. He took a slow breath, choosing his words with more care than he'd used in any tactical briefing. I'm not talking about ornament. He kept his voice level neutral. A data stream, not an emotional appeal. I'm talking about what I see. You are the strongest person on this station. Your intelligence is terrifying. The precision you operate with. It's like watching a master craftsperson work. Every move has purpose. Every word has weight. He paused, letting the observations hang in the air between them. None of that disqualifies you from beauty. It just makes it more interesting. She was silent for a long time. The nebula continued its slow, magnificent burn. He could see the tension in the line of her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head as she processed his words. He was reframing the variable, offering a new data set. It was the only language she might possibly accept. She was built to analyze data, not emotions. Her response, when it came, was quieter. The absolute refusal was gone, replaced by something more complex. A questioning, a recalculation. It is unnecessary, she said, the words sounding unfamiliar in her mouth as if she was testing their shape. Such observations are superficial. They are distractions. Praise for things I did not choose. This was the core of it. Her appearance, her physique, her inherent traits, they were givens. Tools in a kit. To be praised for them was illogical. It was like praising a wrench for being metal. It's not praise for what you are, Elias countered, his voice soft but firm. It's an observation of the whole system. The strength, the mind, the terrifying precision. It all works together. It's efficient. And efficiency can be beautiful, can't it? He was speaking her language now, translating a human concept into a framework she could compute. She didn't answer immediately. The rigid set of her spine seemed to lessen by a fraction of a degree. The hard defensive angles of her posture softened almost imperceptibly. She was still looking out at the stars, but her focus seemed turned inward, running the new parameters through her internal systems. The conflict was visible in the slight tremor of her gloved hand where it rested against the observation rail. It was the first truly unscripted, uncalculated movement he had ever seen from her. It lasted only a second before she stilled it. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the empty void of dismissal. It was a full-charged quiet, humming with unspoken reevaluation. The defensive perimeter she maintained around herself hadn't been breached, but a new gate had been proposed. A new variable had been introduced into her closed, efficient system, and it didn't compute as an error. It computed as a paradox. And for a mind built on logic, a paradox is the most compelling problem there is. She didn't accept the compliment. She didn't thank him. But she also didn't reject it again. She simply stood there, integrated with the starfield, processing. The moment hung in the balance, a delicate thing. Then the station's comm system chimed. A low-priority alert for a minor pressure drop in Sector 2. The spell broke. She turned from the viewport, her movements returning to their usual economical precision. But her eyes, as they passed over him, held a new, unreadable depth. The moment was over, but the equation had been permanently altered. Something had shifted in the foundation of who she believed herself to be. The quiet in the observatory didn't last. The station's proximity alert chimed, a soft, insistent tone that usually meant a supply drone or a piece of orbital debris on a near-miss trajectory. Elias tapped his comms unit. Here. What's the traffic? The voice on the other end was tight with a confusion that bordered on alarm. Sir, we're getting a signature. It's not on any registry. It just appeared. No engine flare, no comms handshake. It's holding position 500 meters off the starboard docking array. On the main screen, a schematic flickered to life. The object was a perfect sphere, matte black, about the size of a personnel shuttle. It gave off no heat, no energy readings beyond a faint, steady hum that the sensors could barely classify. It was just there, a hole in space. They met it in the main airlock bay, a full security detail flanking Elias and Carrie. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of ozone and nervous sweat. The external doors cycled open with a heavy clunk of hydraulics, revealing the void and the object now floating serenely just beyond the force field. It drifted inward, passing through the energy barrier without a ripple, and settled onto the deck plates with a soundless finality. The sphere didn't open. a section of its surface simply reconfigured, flowing like liquid metal to form a tall, slender figure. It was humanoid, but only in the most basic sense. 7 feet tall, its form was a seamless, polished gray material that seemed to absorb the light around it. It had no face, no discernible features beyond a smooth oval head and long articulated limbs. It stood perfectly still, a statue carved from something denser than stone. This was a sentinel, a relic from the Fracture era, a time so old it was half myth. They were gatekeepers, storytellers, and they never left their posts without reason. Elias took a half-step forward, his hand resting near the sidearm he knew would be useless. Identify yourself. This is a restricted Terran-conquered outpost. The figure didn't move. Then a sound emanated from it. Not from a mouth, but from the air around it. A deep, resonant vibration that settled in the bones more than the ears. The language was unlike anything on the station's linguistic banks. It was layered, complex, full of clicks and tonal shifts that sounded like stones grinding together underwater. It was archaic, precise. A dead language speaking to the living. Elias glanced at Carrie. Her reaction was the only thing that mattered. She had gone rigid, her head tilted slightly as she listened. Her pale eyes were wide, fixed on the sentinel. She understood it. The sounds weren't random noise to her. They were history. A dialect of memory and legacy. Something from before the wars, before the factions, from the very first spiral of her people's consciousness. This wasn't a visit. It was a summons. The sentinel's speech shifted, the ancient tones smoothing into something slightly more recognizable, though still impossibly formal and old. It was speaking to her now, its featureless head oriented toward her alone. "We seek parley with the last blood of the first spiral," it intoned. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't for a diplomat. It wasn't for a soldier. It was for her specifically by a title she clearly recognized but never expected to hear. Elias's wartime instincts screamed trap. This thing, this artifact from a brutal past, shows up out of nowhere, ignores all protocols, and addresses her with a phrase that sounded like a line from a religious text. He'd seen Verlian ambushes before. They often started with something poetic. "Carrie," he said, his voice low. "What is this? What does that mean?" She didn't look at him. Her entire being was focused on the sentinel. "It is a title," she said, her voice hushed, almost reverent. "From the origin texts. It means the direct lineage, the unbroken thread back to the beginning." She took a slow step forward toward the figure. "You guard the deep vaults. The places of remembering. Why have you come here?" "The cycle remains incomplete," the sentinel replied, its voice a calm, deep thrum. "The archives are silent. The echoes quarrel without a center. Access is requested, not demanded, earned. It wasn't asking for permission to board. It was asking for permission to guide them somewhere. To a place of buried history. A negotiation, but not for traitor territory, for truth." Elias felt the situation tilting on its axis. His mission was diplomacy, mineral rights, border security. This was something else entirely. This was archaeology with a pulse, theology with a security detail. He saw the tension in Carrie's frame, the way her crystalline spines seemed to vibrate with a low, almost subsonic frequency. The phrase had landed on her not as an honor, but as a weight. It positioned her at the center of something vast and ancient, something she thought was lost to time and war. Her identity wasn't just her own anymore. It was a key to a locked door. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze locked with the sentinel's blank face. Elias could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of risk against a pull she clearly felt in her very blood. This was the core of the Verlian contradiction. A people who valued cold efficiency above all, yet were bound by a deep, almost spiritual connection to their origin. She could refuse. She could label this a distraction, an illogical diversion from her mission. She could walk away. She didn't. Her decision was swift, certain. She turned her head just enough to look at Elias, and he saw a new resolve in her eyes, something that had nothing to do with the Conquered or the Terran Alliance. "It is not a trap," she said, answering his unspoken fear. "It is a test." She looked back at the sentinel and gave a single sharp nod. "We will earn it." The shift was immediate and absolute. The sentinel's form flowed back into the perfect sphere. Their mission was no longer about diplomacy. The trade agreements, the border disputes, the careful dance of two cultures learning not to kill each other. It all faded into background noise. They were going on a quest, not for a weapon or a resource, but for an identity. Elias felt the familiar adrenaline of a drop into unknown territory. But this was different. The enemy wasn't out there. The enemy was time and memory and the ghosts of a past that refused to stay buried. He was no longer just a captain guarding a diplomat. He was a witness to a resurrection. The Sentinel sphere led them down, past the station's functional decks and into the planetary crust itself. The lift didn't feel like it moved. The world outside the viewport simply blurred and reformed into deeper, older rock strata. They exited into a cavern that defied human architecture. It wasn't built. It was grown or perhaps carved by something that thought in geological time. The air was cool and carried a scent of ozone and crushed quartz. Elias felt the shift in pressure in his inner ears, a constant low hum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. This wasn't a room. It was the inside of a mind. The core temple was a cathedral of light and data. The walls weren't stone. They were crystalline matrices that pulsed with a soft internal luminescence, shifting through shades of blue and violet, like the belly of a deep-sea creature. Information didn't display on screens here. It swam in the air, streams of glyphs and shifting schematics that flowed like schools of bioluminescent fish. The scale was immense, the ceiling lost in a soft haze of energy mist. It felt less like a place and more like a living system, a single enormous machine dedicated to one purpose: memory. At the chamber's heart stood the tree. It wasn't organic, not in any earth sense. It was a branching holographic construct of pure white light, its form both delicate and impossibly complex, a fractal pattern that drew the eye into its endless iterations. It was the central index, the root system of everything they were about to see. The sentinel halted before it, its smooth form reflecting the tree's gentle glow. It didn't speak. It simply extended one slender limb and the tree reacted. The light shifted. Branches reconfigured, and from the central trunk dozens of humanoid projections bloomed into existence. They were all Carrie, a child with smaller, less defined crystalline spines, her eyes wide with a curiosity that her present self had long since disciplined away. A teenager in basic combat gear, her face set in a grim line during a training exercise, moving with a lethal grace that was already fully formed. A young soldier streaked with grime, standing amidst the wreckage of a battlefield, her expression hollowed out by loss. A survivor, curled in a defensive posture in a med bay, her body humming with unresolved trauma. Dozens of her, every major inflection point, every moment that had forged the woman now standing rigidly beside Elias. Her breath caught in her throat. She was watching a holographic echo of herself learn to field strip a particle rifle. The movements were jerky, unpracticed. The present-day Kari, the master of terrifying precision, watched her past self fumble with the power cell. Her hands, clenched at her sides, trembled slightly. This wasn't a recording. It felt more vital than that. It was a living archive of her becoming. Elias watched her watch herself, and he understood the profound violation and gift of it all. There were no secrets here. Every triumph, every failure, every hidden shame was on display in the light. Beneath the tree, at the point where all the roots of light converged, a single sphere pulsed with a slower, deeper rhythm. It was the color of a nascent star, a warm golden white. This was the Genesis node, the source imprint, not of Carrie but of her entire people, the first consciousness, the original spark of thought and identity from which every subsequent Verlian mind had been branched. It was the one fixed point in this river of memory, the prime code from which all others were derived. Looking at it was like looking at the first page of a holy book, written in a language of pure potential. The sentinel's voice resonated through the chamber, calm and immense. It wasn't addressing Elias. It was speaking a fundamental truth directly into Carrie's core. You were not born for war. The words landed with the weight of a planet. You were made for remembrance. The reframe was absolute, total. It cut through a lifetime of conditioning. Her entire existence, her value to the conquered, her own self-image as a weapon of calculated efficiency, it was all a secondary function. A mutation, a wrong turn in the code. Her primary purpose, her reason for being was this: to hold, to remember, to be the library, not the soldier. She shook her head, a minute reflexive denial. My function is service. Tactical analysis. Strategic. Her voice trailed off. The evidence against her argument was shining all around her. Versions of herself she had locked away because they didn't serve the function of war. The child, the student, the mourner, they were all here and they were all her. The Sentinel had not called a weapon to this place. It had called a historian home. The offer was made without ceremony. The golden light of the Genesis node brightened, and the countless streams of data flowing through the temple shifted their course, orienting toward her. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation to a transaction. A download, not of files but of lived experience. 1,000 lifetimes of culture, art, philosophy, scientific discovery, and 1,000 lifetimes of the trauma that followed. The paranoia, the fracturing, the long, bloody slide into the warfare that had defined her. It was all there, hovering in the light, waiting for a vessel, waiting for her. The weight of it became a tangible force in the room. Elias could feel it, a pressure against his skin. For Carrie, it must have been crushing. This was the legacy she was heir to, not just a military rank or a diplomatic posting. This was the joy and the sorrow of her entire species, the complete record of everything they had been before they forgot how to be anything but soldiers. To accept it was to voluntarily take on that weight, to let those echoes live inside her, to become a living archive. The woman who had built an identity on precision and control was being asked to open herself to a chaotic, beautiful, and horrifying flood of everything she was meant to be. She stood before the tree of her own life and the cradle of her people's soul, and for the first time since he had known her, Captain Elias Ree saw something that looked like true fear in her eyes. The descent into the abyss felt less like moving through space and more like sinking into a silent ocean. The light from the temple faded behind them, replaced by a deep, resonant gloom. The air grew cold and carried a strange metallic taste like blood and charged capacitors. They followed the Sentinel's smooth, floating sphere down a narrow passage lined with obsidian. The walls weren't inert rock. They pulsed with a faint, slow light, veins of energy threading through the blackness. It felt like walking into a sleeping heart. The only sound was the hum, which was no longer external but seemed to vibrate inside Elias's skull, a low-frequency thrum that spoke of immense power held in check. The vault itself was a circular chamber, perhaps 30 meters across. There were no holograms here, no flowing data streams. The walls, floor, and ceiling were a single continuous surface of the same veined obsidian, polished to a mirror finish that reflected their dim forms back into infinity. At the center of the room, a complex web of thick black cabling rose from the floor, twisting and intertwining to form a rough sphere about 10 feet in diameter. The cables weren't inert. They glowed from within with a shifting, chaotic light, flashes of angry red, pulses of desperate blue, flickers of a sickly, anxious green. This was the crucible, and within those obsidian wires lived the echoes. They weren't recordings. They were raw consciousness, minds shattered during the last, most brutal phase of the war, preserved here not as data but as pure, undiluted psyche. The Sentinel halted at the edge of the chamber. Its voice, when it came, was softer than before, almost respectful of the space. The fractured remain, it said. The cycle must be completed. They require a center, a self to cohere around. It turned its featureless face toward Carrie. The instruction was clear. She wasn't here to observe. She was here to absorb, to integrate these broken pieces into the whole she was becoming. The air in the chamber began to thicken. The chaotic light within the cable sphere intensified and a sound started to build. It wasn't a voice, not at first. It was a chorus of overlapping sensations, a sharp spike of rage, a cold wave of calculation, a raw scream of betrayal, a soft, pleading whisper for it all to just stop. Then the voices resolved, distinct and agonizingly clear, arguing from within the light. The only logical action is containment, one stated, its tone icy, ruthless. Isolate the emotional variable. It is a weakness that compromised the entire defense grid of Terra 7. This was the fierce, calculating mind, the pure expression of Verlian military doctrine stripped of all humanity. They promised us a truce. Another voice countered, ragged with pain. We lowered the shields. They fired the moment the field dropped. The energy discharge vaporized the entire northern quadrant. My unit was there. This was the betrayed survivor, the mind frozen in the moment of ultimate violation, its worldview shattered not by superior force, but by broken faith. The two voices clashed, a brutal debate between cold strategy and raw trauma. a perfect representation of the internal conflict that had torn her people apart. A third voice cut through the argument, quieter but somehow more insistent. There has to be a reason, a pattern we're missing, a way to make it all fit together. The pain, the strategy, it can't just be for nothing. This was the gentle, searching self, the scholar or scientist whose drive for understanding had been overwhelmed by the senselessness of the violence. It pleaded for coherence, for a narrative that could make the suffering mean something. They were all her. These weren't strangers. They were aspects of her own people's collective trauma, raw nerve endings of the history she had agreed to carry, and they were furious, lost, and desperate for a home. The sentinel gave no further instruction. It simply waited. The task was hers. Carrie took a step toward the central sphere. The light from the cables flared and the voices grew louder, turning toward her presence. She was the new variable, the potential center. The fight was no longer out there. It was about to become entirely internal. Cleus could only watch, his own breath tight in his chest. This was a battlefield with no weapons, no tactics he could understand, a cosmic struggle for identity happening in the space between heartbeats. She reached out a hand, her fingers hovering just above one of the glowing cables. The moment she made contact, her entire body seized. A jolt of raw experience, not memory, but the living feeling of it, racked her frame. She didn't cry out. Her jaw clenched, her head thrown back, her crystalline spines blazing with refracted light from the storm she was now channeling. The voices weren't outside her anymore. They were inside. The calculating strategist tried to dominate, to impose order through sheer force of will. The betrayed survivor recoiled, flooding her with its paralyzing fear and distrust. The gentle seeker begged her to find an answer, to fix the unfixable. Elias saw the conflict play out on her face. Her expression flickered through a terrifying range of emotions. Cold disdain, gut-wrenching agony, desperate curiosity, each one taking over for a second before being pushed down by another. She was a ship in a hurricane, being pulled apart by the competing winds of these fractured selves. They weren't integrating. They were trying to consume her, to use her vessel to continue their war. The warning in the research was real. This wasn't a passive download. It was a hostile takeover of the soul. For a long moment it looked like they would win. Her knees buckled slightly. Her own light dimmed under the onslaught. The voices rose in a cacophony of competing truths, each one valid in its pain, each one claiming to be the whole story. This was the danger of the process. To integrate trauma is not to be conquered by it. She had to find a way to hold it without being defined by it. Then something shifted. Her spine straightened. The tremors in her hands stilled. She slowly lifted her head, and her eyes, when she opened them, held a new, terrifying clarity. The internal storm was still there, but she was no longer its victim. She was its center. Her voice, when she spoke, was layered. It contained the echo of the strategist's ice, the survivor's pain, the seeker's hope. But it was woven together with a new thread, her own unmistakable will. "I hear you," she said, the words vibrating with the combined weight of the echoes. "Your anger is real. Your pain is real. Your questions are real." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first since the process began. "I won't deny you." It was an acknowledgement, a validation. She was accepting them, their truth, their place in the whole. Then came the pivot, the defining clause, the assertion of self that was the entire point of the crucible. "But I will define me." Her voice firmed, cutting through the layered echoes, becoming solely her own again. "Not you." The statement was absolute. It was a drawing of a boundary within her own consciousness. She was the archive, but she was also the archivist. She would hold these stories, these shattered pieces, but she would not be shattered by them. She would contain the multitudes, but she would remain the container. The fierce strategist quieted, its demand for control receding. The betrayed survivor's scream faded to a mournful whisper, its pain acknowledged but no longer ruling. The gentle seeker fell silent, its endless question held in a space of compassion rather than desperate urgency. The light in the obsidian cables didn't vanish. It simply changed. The chaotic, clashing colors softened, blending into a steadier, more coherent silver-white glow. The hum in the room lowered from a dissonant clash to a harmonious, resonant tone. The chorus of quarreling selves didn't die. They were finally, after decades of anguish, listening to each other, and they were all listening to her. The integration wasn't about erasing the parts. It was about facilitating communication and cooperation between them, fostering a unified identity from the fragments. She had done it. She had faced the abyss and refused to let it define her. She had chosen to define it instead. The silence in the vault stretched thick and absolute. It wasn't an empty silence, not the void that had been there before. This was a full, resonant quiet, the kind that follows a symphony's final note, holding the echo of everything that has just happened. The chaotic light within the obsidian cables had softened to a steady, unified silver, casting a calm, moon-like glow across the polished walls. The crucible wasn't a storm anymore. It was a still pool. The voices were gone, not silenced but integrated. The argument was over. Kari's hand remained on the cable, but the tension had bled from her frame. She stood with a new kind of solidity, her shoulders settled, her head held not with militaristic stiffness but with a simple, unforced grace. She drew a slow, deep breath, the first one Elias had seen her take that didn't seem like a calculated intake of oxygen. It was the breath of someone who has finally come home to their own body. Her crystalline spines, which had blazed with refracted conflict, now glowed with a softer, steadier light from within. Like quartz warmed by a low sun, she withdrew her hand and the connection broke with no spark, no jolt. It was seamless. The merge was complete. Elias watched, his own breathing shallow, as if a loud sound might shatter the profound stillness. He saw the slight shift in her posture, the minute relaxation of her jaw. He saw the way her eyes, when she finally opened them, scanned the chamber. They didn't dart with analytical precision. They moved slowly, taking in the vault, the dimmed crucible, her own hands. There was a depth to her gaze that hadn't been there before, a layered awareness. She was seeing the world through 1,000 pairs of eyes now, yet the view was singular. Hers. He understood what he was witnessing. This wasn't a weapon being reforged. It was a person being rebuilt. The soldier was still there, the diplomat, the strategist, all the fragmented roles she had been forced to play. But they were no longer compartmentalized, warring factions inside her. They were instruments in an orchestra, and she was the conductor. She had absorbed the echoes not as a conqueror consumes territory, but as an archive accepts new volumes. The stories of rage, of betrayal, of scholarly curiosity. They were on her shelves now, cataloged and accessible, but they did not dictate the story of the archivist. She carried the memory without being consumed by it. The trauma was a chapter, not the entire book. Her strength, that terrifying, razor-sharp precision he had always seen, was still present. But it was different now. It wasn't a hard defensive shell. It was a core of tempered steel, woven through with the resilience of survived pain and the flexibility of hard-won understanding. Her strength was inseparable from her history because she had chosen to make it so. She had taken the raw materials of a brutal past, the very things she had been taught to reject as weaknesses, and incorporated them into her foundation. She wasn't standing despite her history. She was standing on it. She turned her head and looked at him. There was no flicker of the old defensiveness, no calculating assessment. Her expression was calm, open in a way that was entirely new. She saw him seeing her, and she didn't retreat behind her armor. She simply was. In that look, Elias saw the entire journey. He saw the woman who had frozen at a simple compliment, who had defined herself by a function, who had believed beauty was for soft, fragile things. And he saw the woman who had faced the totality of her people's pain and her own fractured selves and had said, "I will define me." She had walked into the crucible as a weapon of war and walked out a living library of peace. The reconciliation was absolute. The sentinel had not moved. It stood at the periphery of the chamber, its smooth gray form a silent monolith in the silver light. It had been the guide, the gatekeeper, the one who presented the test. Now it was the witness to the result. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its purpose here was fulfilled. It had safeguarded the broken pieces until the whole could come to claim them. It remained as a guardian, not of the vault or the echoes, but of this new hard-won wholeness. It was a testament to the fact that some things, once made complete, are worth protecting. Kari took a step away from the crucible, her boots making no sound on the obsidian floor. She moved with an economy of motion that was familiar, but the intention behind it was different. It wasn't the efficiency of a soldier conserving energy for a fight. It was the grace of someone perfectly balanced within themselves, with no energy wasted on internal conflict. She looked at the sentinel and gave a single slow nod. It was an acknowledgement. A thank you. An affirmation that the cycle was, at long last, complete. The vault seemed to breathe with them, the low hum settling into an even, peaceful frequency. The air lost its metallic taste, replaced by a clean, neutral scent like rain on stone. The oppressive weight that had filled the chamber had lifted, replaced by a sense of profound settling. The fractured had been made whole. The lost had been found a home, and the woman at the center of it all stood with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any display of strength Elias had ever seen. She had redefined every term of her existence on her own authority. The archive was whole and it was alive. The lift carried them back up through the planetary crust, the oppressive weight of the abyss vault giving way to the familiar, grimy hum of the station. They stepped out into a maintenance corridor, the air tasting of recycled oxygen and lubricant again. They were the same people, technically. Elias still wore his rumpled captain's uniform, the fabric smelling of old coffee and stress. Carrie's obsidian armor was still polished to a mirror finish, her crystalline spine a sharp geometry against the dull metal walls. But everything was different. The space between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the shared experience of the vault, the silent understanding of what she had endured and what he had witnessed. Their alliance was no longer a diplomatic formality, a shaky bridge between two suspicious governments. It was a personal pact, forged in the crucible of memory and sealed with a quiet mutual respect. They had looked into the abyss together, and only one of them had gone in, but they had both come out changed. The galaxy outside the station's hull hadn't changed, though. The tension was still there, a live wire running through every comms channel, every policy meeting, every nervous glance in a crowded corridor. Peace was a fragile, unfamiliar state. For decades, the only constants had been territorial disputes, resource skirmishes, and the deep ingrained suspicion that the other side was always one wrong move from restarting the war. That fear was a habit, and habits are hard to break. A galaxy that had learned to thrive on conflict now had to learn how to navigate the terrifying quiet of its absence. The work ahead wasn't just about signing treaties. It was about convincing billions of people on both sides of the border to unlearn generations of fear. The real enemy wasn't each other anymore. It was the inertia of dread. Elias felt the weight of it, the sheer scale of the task. He could see it in the set of Carrie's shoulders, the new depth in her eyes that now held the weight of her people's entire history. It was enough to make anyone sober. So he didn't. He leaned against a coolant pipe, the metal warm against his back, and crossed his arms. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "New plan. Revised operational parameters." Kari turned her head, her expression calm, waiting. She was learning his rhythms. "Step 1, he announced, holding up a finger. Universal health care. Nobody gets left behind in medbay because of faulty region tech or bad paperwork. It's inefficient and it's cruel," he shrugged. "Basic common sense, really." He held up a second finger. "Step 2, planetary pizza delivery. I'm talking hot, reliable, cheesy coverage for every major settlement in the Drift region. A fundamental quality of life upgrade. Morale is a strategic asset." He was dead serious about the first part. The second was pure calculated absurdity. It was his way of anchoring them both in something tangible, something human and slightly ridiculous, to counterbalance the cosmic scale of what they'd just been through. He wasn't making light of the situation. He was building a levee against it with the only material he had. Practical levity. A sound came from Carrie then. It started low, a faint exhalation of air that hitched for a second. Then it built into something clear and unmistakable. Laughter. It wasn't a loud, boisterous sound. It was quiet, layered, a little surprised at its own existence. It was the sound of a pressure valve blowing after being sealed for a lifetime. It was a sound Elias would have once labeled a statistical impossibility. Her shoulders shook slightly and she brought a gloved hand up, not to cover her mouth but just to rest against her chest. As if feeling the unfamiliar vibration, her pale eyes crinkled at the corners. It was the most human he had ever seen her, and it was entirely her own. Not a glitch, not a miscalculation. A genuine, spontaneous reaction to the sheer, wonderful absurdity of his proposition, offered in the grim aftermath of an existential trial. That laughter was a new line of code in her programming, one she had written herself. The shuttle bay was quiet. Their ride back to the main diplomatic vessel waited, a sleek Verlian craft sitting beside a boxy Terran transport. They stood between them at the exact midpoint. This was the fold, the line between what was known and what came next. They weren't just crossing from a station to a ship. They were stepping from a past defined by separate warring histories into an unwritten future they would have to author together. There was no map for this. No tactical doctrine covered first contact with your own potential. They were co-authors now, partners in a story that had no guarantee of a happy ending, only the certainty that it would be theirs. Elias looked at her, really looked. He saw the woman who had frozen at a compliment, who had defined herself by utility, who had carried a war inside her without knowing it. And he saw the woman who had faced that war, absorbed it and chosen to build something new from the pieces. Her strength wasn't just in her armor or her mind. It was in that laughter. It was in the courage it took to accept a part of herself she'd been taught to reject. Their reflection wasn't in the polished hull of the shuttle. It was in each other. They had become a single unit of purpose, a combined system stronger for its complexity. Beauty, he thought, wasn't a static quality to be observed. It wasn't a word for soft things. It was a dynamic state, an achievement. It was the visible evidence of things fitting together, of fragments finding a whole, of courage meeting acceptance. It was the precise engineering of a stable orbit, the efficient flow of data through a crystal lattice, the unexpected harmony of two different kinds of logic finding common ground. It was belonging. It was the hard-earned right to be exactly who you are, in concert with another. It was shared. The shuttle's ramp descended with a soft hiss. They didn't hesitate. They walked up it together side by side, their steps falling into a syncopated rhythm on the metal grating. The vow wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It was in the set of their shoulders, the certainty of their movement. The work was clear. To rebuild what was broken, not by erasing the past, but by remembering it completely, to carry the memories, the pain and the joy not as a burden, but as a foundation, and to do it all with a steadfast commitment that was, in its own efficient way, a form of love. The airlock sealed behind them. The engines powered up, a low, clean thrum that vibrated through the deck. They were moving. The unknown waited, and they were ready to meet it, not as a captain and a diplomat, but as architects of a future they would forge themselves. Kari's journey shows us that beauty isn't a flaw to be denied, but a kind of strength we claim for ourselves. She began believing that word is not for me, a phrase meant to protect her from the vulnerability she'd been taught was weakness. Her story asks us to look at the narrow boxes we build for ourselves and others, often shaped by what our world tells us is acceptable or strong. It takes courage to pull all the pieces of our history, the soft and the sharp, into one identity and call it whole. But that's where real resilience lives,